The blood came too early, and the baby arrived under a red moon that cast shadows like claws across the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1876. And before the child even drew his second breath, the midwife stumbled backward and made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. Sarah Mitchell had labored alone in the small room above the general store, her husband dead 6 months from a rattlesnake bite while working cattle on the Henderson Ranch, leaving her with nothing but debt and a baby growing in her belly. She was 22 years old, and every woman in town had warned her that grief could poison a child in the womb, that sorrow would mark him somehow, make him wrong. Now, as she reached for her son with exhausted arms, the midwife held him away, her weathered face gone pale as parchment. "Mrs. Mitchell, this child has the mark," the old woman whispered, her voice carrying the weight of pronouncement. "Born feet first under the blood moon, and look here at his chest, this birthmark shaped like a devil's pitchfork. This baby is cursed, sure as I am standing here." Sarah struggled to sit up, her body screaming in protest, her hands grasping at empty air. "Give me my son," she demanded, but her voice came out weak and thready. "Give him to me now." The midwife placed the squalling infant in Sarah's arms with obvious reluctance, backing toward the door as if the child might burst into flames. "I will have to tell the preacher," she said. "The town needs to know. A cursed child brings misfortune on everyone." Before Sarah could respond, the woman fled, her footsteps clattering down the wooden stairs, and Sarah was left alone with her newborn son. She pulled back the thin blanket and examined him in the lamplight. He was small but perfectly formed, with a thatch of dark hair and eyes that seemed to focus on her face with unusual intensity. On his chest, just over his heart, was indeed a birthmark, 3 lines converging to a point, dark red against his pale skin. To Sarah, it looked like an arrow pointing upward, not a pitchfork pointing down. "You are not cursed," she whispered to him, pressing her lips to his forehead. "You are mine, and you are perfect, and I will call you Samuel, after my father, who was the best man I ever knew." But by morning, the damage was done. The midwife had spent the night going door to door, spreading the word about the cursed child born to the widow Mitchell. When Sarah finally made her way downstairs, weak and dizzy, clutching Samuel to her chest, she found the store owner, Mr. Pritchard, waiting with his arms crossed and his face set in hard lines. "I am sorry, Mrs. Mitchell, but I cannot have you living here any longer," he said without preamble. "You owe 3 months' rent already, and now with this business about the child, well, it is bad for my establishment. People are already saying they will not shop here if I harbor a cursed infant under my roof." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Mr. Pritchard, please, I have nowhere to go. Give me another week and I will find work. I will pay what I owe." "No one in this town will hire you now," he said flatly. "Not with that child. You need to leave Redemption Creek, go somewhere folks do not know about the circumstances of his birth. That is my advice." She stood there in the morning light streaming through the store windows, her son wrapped in the only blanket she owned, and realized she was truly alone. Her parents were dead, her husband was dead, and she had no siblings, no family to turn to. The few friends she had made in Redemption Creek would shun her now, too frightened of the town's judgment to risk association. By noon, she had gathered her few possessions into a carpetbag and stood on the edge of town, the sun blazing overhead, no idea where to go or how to survive. Samuel slept against her shoulder, blissfully unaware that the world had already decided he was damned. Sarah had $4.30 to her name, a change of clothes, and a fierce determination that her son would not suffer for superstition and ignorance. She started walking west, toward the Henderson Ranch where her husband had died. It was 5 miles outside of town, and maybe, just maybe, old man Henderson would take pity on her and give her work. She made it 2 miles before her legs began to shake, her body still recovering from childbirth, the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight. She sat beneath a scraggly oak tree, nursing Samuel and trying not to cry when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. The rider came into view slowly, a tall figure on a paint horse, and as he drew closer, Sarah recognized him as one of the ranch hands who sometimes came into town for supplies. She had seen him before, always polite, always keeping to himself, a man maybe 5 or 6 years older than herself with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of creek water. He wore a dusty hat pulled low, a bandana around his neck, and guns at his hips like most men did in this part of Texas. But there was something gentle in the way he sat his horse, something that made her think he was not a man quick to violence. He reined in when he saw her, his gaze taking in the scene with quick understanding. A woman alone on the road, a baby in her arms, a carpetbag at her feet, and the unmistakable look of desperation on her face. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "you are a long way from town. Is everything all right?" She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question, but it came out as a choked sob instead. "No," she managed, "nothing is all right, but I do not expect that is your concern." He dismounted in one fluid motion, ground tying his horse, and approached slowly, carefully, as if she were a spooked animal. "My name is Thomas Garrett," he said. "I worked with your husband before he passed. He was a good man, and I was sorry to hear of his death. Are you in some kind of trouble?" The kindness in his voice broke something loose in her chest, and the whole story came tumbling out. The birth, the midwife's pronouncement, the eviction, the town's condemnation of her innocent child. She heard how crazy it sounded as she spoke, how medieval and backwards, but this was Redemption Creek in 1876, and superstition still held more sway than sense in many corners of the frontier. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he crouched down beside her, his attention fixed on the baby in her arms. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hands. Sarah hesitated, then carefully transferred Samuel to him. Thomas Garrett held her son with the ease of someone who had handled infants before, supporting his head, looking down at him with an expression Sarah could not quite read. Samuel opened his eyes, those dark blue infant eyes, and seemed to stare right into Thomas's face. "So the town thinks he is cursed," Thomas said quietly. He pulled the blanket aside slightly, saw the birthmark on the tiny chest, and smiled. "That is not the mark of a curse. That is the mark of an arrow flying true, pointing toward heaven. This child is not cursed, Mrs. Mitchell. He is blessed." The words hung in the hot afternoon air like a benediction, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saying that." Thomas looked up at her, and she saw something fierce and protective in his expression. "I am not just saying it, I believe it. And I am not going to let you walk another mile in this heat when you should be resting. I am taking you to the Henderson Ranch. Mr. Henderson is a fair man, and he will listen to me. If I vouch for you, he will give you a place to stay and work when you are ready." "I cannot ask you to do that," Sarah protested weakly. "You do not even know me." "I knew your husband," Thomas said firmly, "and that is enough. Besides, it is the right thing to do, and I was raised to do right when I could." He handed Samuel back to her and stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Come on now, let us get you out of this sun before you collapse." He lifted her carpetbag and tied it to his saddle, then helped her mount his horse before swinging up behind her. She sat sideways in the saddle, cradling Samuel, while Thomas kept one arm around her waist to steady her and took the reins with the other hand. The closeness should have felt improper, but Sarah was too exhausted and grateful to care about propriety, and there was something solid and reassuring about Thomas Garrett's presence, something that made her feel safe for the first time in months. The Henderson Ranch sprawled across 1,000 acres of Texas grassland, with a main house, a bunkhouse for the hands, a large barn, and several corrals. When they rode in, several men looked up from their work, their eyes widening at the sight of Thomas carrying a woman and baby, but he ignored them and headed straight for the main house. James Henderson came out onto the porch, a grizzled man in his 60s with a thick gray beard and shrewd eyes. Thomas, he said, his gaze moving from the cowboy to Sarah and back again. What have we got here? Thomas dismounted and helped Sarah down with careful hands. Sir, this is Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, widow of David Mitchell, who worked for us last year. She is in need of help and I am asking you to provide it. Henderson's eyes narrowed. I heard some talk in town this morning, something about a cursed baby, that the situation here. There is no curse, Thomas said flatly. There is only a grieving widow, a newborn child, and a town full of ignorant fools. She needs a place to stay and eventually a way to earn her keep. I am personally vouching for her, and I will take responsibility. Sarah wanted to protest that she did not need anyone taking responsibility for her, but the words died in her throat. She did need help, desperately, and pride was a luxury she could not afford with a baby depending on her. Henderson studied them both for a long moment, then sighed. Let me see the child. Sarah's arms tightened around Samuel protectively, but Thomas gave her a small nod of encouragement. She stepped forward and carefully revealed her son's face. Henderson looked down at the sleeping baby and something in his weathered face softened. He looks like a regular baby to me, he said gruffly. Scrawny little thing, but I suppose they all are at that age. You can stay in the small cabin out past the barn. It is not much, but it has a roof and a stove. Thomas, you will make sure it is cleaned out and suitable. Mrs. Mitchell, you will rest for the next 2 weeks while you recover your strength. After that, we will discuss work. My wife could use help with the cooking and the garden. Does that sound acceptable? Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. More than acceptable, Mr. Henderson, thank you. I will work hard, I promise. See that you do, he said, but his voice was not unkind. And Mrs. Mitchell, I do not hold with superstitious nonsense. You and your boy are welcome here as long as you earn your way, but if there is trouble from the town, I expect you to keep it off my property. Understood? Yes, sir, Sarah said quickly. I understand. Henderson nodded and went back inside, and Thomas touched her elbow gently. Come on, let us get you settled. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was clean once Thomas swept it out and chased away the spiders that had taken residence. There was a rope bed with a thin mattress, a table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a few shelves. Thomas brought blankets from the bunkhouse, a pillow, some dishes, and a basket of food he begged from the ranch cook, an older Mexican woman named Rosa who clicked her tongue sympathetically when she heard Sarah's story. Those people in town, they are fools, Rosa declared, packing tortillas, beans, and dried beef into the basket. A baby is a blessing always, no matter what marks he carries. You tell Mrs. Mitchell I will come visit tomorrow and bring proper food for a nursing mother. By the time Thomas had the cabin ready, Sarah was swaying on her feet, exhaustion crashing over her in waves. He guided her to the bed and she sank down gratefully, still clutching Samuel. You should sleep, Thomas said quietly. You are safe here. No one will bother you. Sarah looked up at him, this man who had appeared out of nowhere like an answer to a prayer she had not even said. Why are you doing this? She asked. You do not owe me anything. Thomas was silent for a moment, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. My sister had a baby 2 years ago, he said finally. The baby was born with a twisted foot, and there were whispers in our town back in Kansas that it was because my sister had been seen talking to a half-breed trader, that maybe the baby was cursed for that association. It was all lies and cruelty. The baby's father was her husband, a good man, but the talk nearly destroyed them. They had to leave, start over somewhere else. I saw what that kind of judgment did to my sister, and I swore if I ever had the chance to stand against that kind of ignorance, I would. He met her eyes, and Sarah saw pain there, old anger tempered by time. Besides, he added, a small smile tugging at his mouth, I looked at your son and I saw a fighter. He came into this world backwards under a strange moon, and he is still here, breathing strong. That is not a curse. That is courage. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Thank you, Thomas, she said softly. I will not forget this kindness. "Rest now," he said, backing toward the door. "I will check on you in the morning." After he left, Sarah lay back on the bed, Samuel nestled against her side, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The next weeks passed in a blur of healing and adjustment. Rosa came daily with food and advice, teaching Sarah how to manage on the limited supplies available, how to stretch a pound of flour, how to make soap from lye and fat. The older woman was a wealth of practical knowledge, and she doted on Samuel, declaring him the most handsome baby she had ever seen and making a small charm from woven grass to hang over his bed, for protection and luck. Thomas came by every evening after his work was done, always with some excuse. He was checking that the stove was drawing properly, or making sure the roof was not leaking, or bringing a rocking chair he had found in the barn that might be useful for a woman with a baby. Sarah quickly realized these were just pretenses to visit, to make sure she and Samuel were truly all right, but she did not mind. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to the sound of his boots on the wooden porch, to the way his face softened when he looked at her son. They talked about everything and nothing during those visits. Thomas told her about growing up on a farm in Kansas, the youngest of 5 children, how he had headed west after the war looking for work and adventure, how he had found that ranch work suited him better than farming. Sarah told him about her own childhood in Missouri, her parents who had died of fever when she was 17, how she had married David Mitchell when she was 19 and followed him to Texas full of dreams about building a new life. "Were you happy with him?" Thomas asked one evening, and there was something careful in the question, as if he was not sure he had the right to ask. Sarah considered the question honestly. "I was content," she said finally. "David was a good man, kind and hardworking. I did not love him the way the novels talk about love, that all-consuming passion, but I cared for him deeply and he cared for me. We would have built a good life together if he had lived." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze on the horizon where the sun was setting in shades of orange and red. "Content is more than many people get," he said. "My parents had that kind of marriage, respect and partnership. It is a solid foundation." "What about you?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Why has a man like you not married?" He smiled at that, a rueful expression. "A man like me? What kind of man is that?" "The kind women notice," Sarah said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks but pushing forward anyway. "Good-looking, steady work, clearly kind-hearted. I cannot imagine you lack for opportunities." Thomas laughed, a rich, warm sound that made something flutter in Sarah's stomach. "You flatter me, Mrs. Mitchell. Truth is, I have been too busy moving around to settle down. A woman wants a home, stability, and until recently I could not offer that. I have been saving my wages, though, thinking maybe in another year or two I might have enough to buy some land of my own, start a small ranch. Then maybe I will think about courting." "That sounds like a fine plan," Sarah said, and tried to ignore the small pang of disappointment that accompanied the words. Thomas was helping her out of kindness and obligation to her late husband, nothing more. She had no right to feel anything beyond gratitude. But as the weeks turned into a month, and then 2 months, Sarah had to admit to herself that what she felt for Thomas Garrett was growing far beyond gratitude. She noticed everything about him, the way he pushed his hat back when he was thinking, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the gentleness in his rough hands when he held Samuel. He had taken to visiting every evening without pretense now, often bringing his dinner from the cookhouse to eat with her at the small table. And those evenings had become the brightest part of Sarah's days. Samuel was thriving, growing plump and healthy, his eyes starting to change from baby blue to a warm brown like his father's had been. He smiled now, real smiles that lit up his whole face, and he seemed to reserve his biggest smiles for Thomas, reaching for him with tiny fists whenever the cowboy came near. "He loves you," Sarah said one evening, watching as Thomas lifted Samuel high in the air, making the baby crow with delight. "He never fusses when you hold him." That is because I am teaching him important life skills, Thomas said seriously, bringing Samuel down to blow a raspberry against his belly. The baby shrieked with laughter, like how to charm the ladies and how to spot a good horse. Essential knowledge for a Texas man. Sarah laughed, her heart full almost to bursting. This, she thought, this is what happiness feels like. Not the content piece she had found with David, but something brighter and sharper, something that made her feel truly alive for the first time in her adult life. She caught Thomas looking at her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read, something intense and yearning, but he always looked away quickly, and Sarah told herself she was imagining things. Why would a man like Thomas Garrett look at a penniless widow with a child that way? He could have his pick of unmarried girls in any town, women without baggage or scandal attached to their names. 3 months after arriving at the Henderson Ranch, Sarah started working in the main house, helping with cooking and cleaning. Mrs. Henderson was a quiet woman with steel-gray hair and shrewd eyes like her husband, and she worked Sarah hard but fairly. Sarah brought Samuel with her, keeping him in a basket near whatever room she was working in, and the baby was generally good, seeming to understand even at his young age that his mother needed him to cooperate. The work was exhausting, but Sarah was grateful for it. She was earning her keep and slowly saving a few coins toward an uncertain future. She knew she could not stay at the Henderson Ranch forever. Eventually, she would need to move on, find a town where no one knew about the circumstances of Samuel's birth, where she could build a real life for them both. But the thought of leaving made her chest ache, and she knew it was not just because the ranch had become a haven. It was because leaving would mean saying goodbye to Thomas, and she was not sure she could bear that. The crisis came in late October, when the first cool winds began to blow across the plains. A group of men rode out from Redemption Creek. Leading them was Preacher Blackwood, a fire and brimstone man who Sarah had always found more frightening than comforting. They came right up to the ranch house, dismounting in a cloud of dust, and demanded to speak with Henderson about the cursed child he was harboring. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard the commotion. She ran to the window, Samuel in her arms, and her blood ran cold when she saw the preacher and his delegation. Mrs. Henderson put a hand on her shoulder. "Stay here," the older woman said firmly. "James will handle this." But Sarah could not help but creep closer to the door, listening as voices rose on the front porch. "You are sheltering an abomination, Henderson," Preacher Blackwood was saying, his voice carrying the rhythm of his sermons. "That child is marked by the devil, and his presence brings misfortune. Since he has been here, have you not lost 3 head of cattle to illness? Did your barn not nearly catch fire last week? These are signs, warnings that you are courting disaster." "Those are normal ranch problems, Blackwood," Henderson said, and Sarah could hear the steel in his voice. "Cattle get sick, lightning strikes happen. You are seeing patterns where there are none." "The Lord has given us eyes to see his warnings," the preacher insisted. "That woman and her demon-marked child need to be driven out, sent away from God-fearing folk. We have come to demand that you dismiss her from your employment immediately." "You have come to demand." Henderson's voice went dangerously quiet. "This is my property, preacher, and I will hire and fire as I see fit. Mrs. Mitchell is a hard worker, and her baby is just a baby. I will not turn them out because of your superstitious nonsense." "Then you risk the wrath of—" "The wrath of what?" A new voice cut in, and Sarah's heart jumped. "Thomas. The wrath of a God who said to suffer little children, the wrath of a Lord who preached compassion and mercy. Or just the wrath of small-minded men who are afraid of what they do not understand." Sarah moved to where she could see through the window. Thomas had appeared from the direction of the barn, and several other ranch hands were gathering behind him, forming a solid wall of support. Preacher Blackwood turned to him, his face reddening. "You are the one, are you not? The one who brought the cursed woman here, I should have known. Thomas Garrett, defender of half-breeds and devil children, your own soul must be tainted." "My soul is between me and my Maker," Thomas said evenly. And I answer to Mr. Henderson, not to you. Now I suggest you and your men get back on your horses and return to town before this gets unpleasant." One of the men with the preacher, a heavy-set farmer named Hutchins, spat on the ground. "You think you can threaten us, Cowboy? There are 8 of us and maybe a dozen of you. We could burn this whole place down if we wanted." The sound of guns being cocked echoed across the yard. Every ranch hand had drawn their weapon, and they were all trained on the men from town. Henderson himself had a shotgun cradled in his arms. "You could try," Henderson said mildly. "But I expect most of you would be dead before you struck the first match. Now I am a patient man, but that patience has limits. You have 30 seconds to mount up and leave my property, or I will have my men escort you off with prejudice." For a moment, the tension was thick enough to cut, and Sarah held Samuel close, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then Preacher Blackwood turned abruptly and stalked back to his horse. "You have made your choice, Henderson," he said as he mounted. "But mark my words, tragedy will follow that cursed child wherever he goes. Do not say you were not warned." The delegation from town rode away, and Sarah sagged against the wall in relief. Mrs. Henderson squeezed her shoulder. "You are all right, dear," she said. "Those men are cowards. They will not come back." But Sarah was not so sure. She had seen the zealous conviction in Preacher Blackwood's eyes, the kind of conviction that could justify almost anything. That evening, when Thomas came by the cabin as usual, she met him at the door before he could knock. "I need to leave," she said without preamble. "I cannot put the Hendersons at risk like this, or you. I will pack tonight and be gone in the morning." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You are not going anywhere." "Thomas, you heard what they said. There will be more trouble and eventually someone is going to get hurt. I cannot have that on my conscience." "Then it is lucky it is not your choice to make," Thomas said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Mr. Henderson is not going to fire you, Sarah. And I am not going to let you wander off alone with a baby and nowhere to go." "I will manage," Sarah said, lifting her chin. "I have been managing on my own since I was 17 years old." "You do not have to manage on your own anymore," Thomas said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that made Sarah's breath catch. "Do you not understand that? You do not have to do this alone." "Why?" The question burst out of her, all her confusion and longing compressed into that single word. "Why do you care so much, Thomas? Why have you spent 3 months helping me, visiting me, acting like my son matters to you? We are nothing to you." "Nothing." Thomas took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "Sarah, you and Samuel are not nothing to me. You are everything." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, and Sarah felt her heart slam against her ribs. "Thomas," she whispered, but she did not know what else to say. "I know I have no right," he said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. "You are still grieving your husband, and I am just a ranch hand with barely $200 to his name, and you probably think I am crazy, but I cannot keep this inside anymore. I care about you, Sarah. I have cared about you since that first day on the road when you looked at me with those fierce eyes and refused to give up on your son. I care about Samuel like he is my own, and if you leave, it will tear my heart clean out of my chest." Sarah stared at him, every careful wall she had built around her heart crumbling like dust. "I care about you too," she said, her voice shaking. "More than I should, more than is wise. You have been so good to us, Thomas, and I am terrified that we are going to ruin your life." "You are not going to ruin anything," Thomas said fiercely. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You and Samuel are the best thing that has happened to me in years. Do you think I visit every evening because I am worried about your stove? I come because I cannot stay away. I come because hearing your laugh is the highlight of my day. I come because when I hold Samuel, I let myself imagine, just for a moment, that he is mine, that you are both mine." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, but they were not tears of sadness. "I am still married in my heart," she managed. "I still wear my ring. It has only been 9 months since David died." "I know," Thomas said gently, his thumbs wiping away her tears. And I am not asking you to forget him or stop grieving, I am just asking you not to leave. Stay here, let me keep watching over you both, and when you are ready, if you are ever ready, let me court you properly. Let me try to win your heart. I will wait as long as it takes. Sarah closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, feeling the warmth and strength of him. Every practical part of her mind was screaming that this was too fast, too complicated, that she should not let herself feel this way so soon after losing David. But her heart, her traitorous, hopeful heart, was singing a different song. I am already half in love with you, she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. Maybe more than half, and that terrifies me because I have lost so much already, and I cannot bear to lose you too. Thomas's expression softened into something so tender it made her ache. You are not going to lose me, he promised. I am not going anywhere, Sarah. Not now, not ever, if you will have me. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed his lips to her forehead in a kiss that was more promise than passion. Sarah's hands came up to grip his shirt, holding him close, breathing in the scent of him, leather and horses and the sage soap he used. I will stay, she said quietly. We will stay. She felt him smile against her forehead. Good, that is real good. From his basket, Samuel made a small cooing sound as if he approved of this arrangement, and they both laughed, the tension breaking. Thomas pulled back and went to scoop up the baby, lifting him high. Hear that, little man? Your mama is staying, which means you are stuck with me. I am going to teach you everything I know, make you the best horseman in Texas. Samuel grabbed Thomas's nose with one chubby fist, and Thomas pretended to be mortally wounded, staggering around the cabin while the baby giggled. Sarah watched them, her hand pressed to her chest, feeling the tight knot of fear that had lived there for months finally beginning to loosen. Maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. The preacher did not return, but his influence lingered. Over the next weeks, Sarah noticed that when she went with Mrs. Henderson into town for supplies, people crossed the street to avoid them. Shopkeepers were brusque and unwelcoming, watching Sarah with suspicious eyes as if waiting for some sign of the curse to manifest. Children were pulled away when she passed, mothers whispering warnings about the devil woman and her marked baby. Sarah held her head high through it all, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cowed, but it wore on her. Thomas saw it, and one evening in early November he came to the cabin with a determined expression. I want to take you somewhere tomorrow, he said, both of you. It is my day off, and I have already asked Mrs. Henderson to spare you for the afternoon. Will you come? Sarah was curious but agreed, and the next morning she found Thomas waiting with a wagon instead of his usual horse. He had filled the back with blankets and cushions, making a comfortable nest, and he helped her up onto the bench seat before taking the reins. They drove for over an hour, heading north away from Redemption Creek, through rolling grassland dotted with cattle and the occasional homestead. Samuel drowsed in Sarah's arms, content with the rocking motion of the wagon, and Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, enjoying the cool autumn air and the vast blue sky overhead. Finally, Thomas turned the wagon off the main trail and up a gentle rise. At the top, he stopped and set the brake, then climbed down and reached up to help Sarah and Samuel descend. Come see, he said, taking her hand and leading her forward. The view took Sarah's breath away. They stood on a bluff overlooking a wide valley where a creek ran silver through the grassland. Trees clustered along the water, their leaves turned gold and red by the season, and in the distance, she could see the dark shapes of a small herd of wild horses grazing peacefully. The land rolled away in all directions, empty and beautiful and full of possibility. This is the prettiest piece of country I have ever seen, Sarah breathed. It is for sale, Thomas said quietly. 200 acres, including water rights to the creek. The man who owned it died last year and his widow moved back east. She is asking $400. Sarah turned to him, her heart beginning to race. Thomas, what are you saying? He took a deep breath, his hand tightening around hers. I have $230 saved. I am asking Mr. Henderson for a loan for the rest, and he has already said yes. I want to buy this land, Sarah. I want to build a house right here on this bluff, with windows facing the valley so we can watch the sun come up every morning. I want to start a ranch, run a few head of cattle, raise horses maybe, and I want to do it with you. Sarah's eyes went wide. Thomas, we have only known each other 4 months. I know, he said. I know it is fast, and I know you are still wearing your wedding ring, and I know this is probably the craziest thing I have ever done. But I also know that I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I love you and I love your son, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. I want to marry you if you will have me, and I want to give Samuel my name so that no one can ever call him cursed again. I want us to be a family. Sarah felt tears welling up, her emotions a tumult of joy and fear and overwhelming love. People will talk, she managed. They will say I moved on too fast, that I am dishonoring David's memory. David is gone, Thomas said gently but firmly. And I am sure he was a good man who would want you to be happy, who would want his son to have a father. People will always talk, Sarah. The question is whether you are going to let their talk determine how you live your life. She looked out at the valley, at this beautiful piece of land that Thomas was offering to build a life on, and then down at Samuel in her arms. Her son was awake now, looking up at her with his solemn dark eyes, and she thought about what she wanted for him. She wanted him to grow up knowing he was loved, that he was wanted, that the mark on his chest did not define him. She wanted him to have a father who would teach him to be a good man, who would protect him and guide him. Thomas could be that father. Thomas already loved Samuel like his own. And she loved Thomas. Not the quiet contentment she had felt for David, but something fierce and bright, something that made her feel brave enough to reach for happiness even in a world that seemed determined to deny it to her. She turned back to Thomas, saw the hope and fear warring in his expression, and made her choice. Yes, she said, and watched his face transform with joy. Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Garrett. I will build a life with you on this beautiful land, and we will raise Samuel together, and we will be happy despite what anyone says. Thomas let out a whoop that startled the distant horses into flight and swept Sarah into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and clutched Samuel between them, the baby shrieking with surprise and delight. When Thomas set her down, he kissed her, really kissed her, his lips warm and sure against hers, and Sarah felt like she was falling and flying all at once. I promise you will not regret this, Thomas said when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless. I promise I will work every day to make you happy. I know you will, Sarah said, reaching up to touch his face. You already have. They were married 3 weeks later by a traveling judge who came through the area, with the Hendersons and most of the ranch hands as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had altered for her, and Thomas wore his best clothes, his hair slicked back and his eyes shining with happiness. Rosa wept throughout the ceremony and afterward threw a feast in the cookhouse with enough food to feed half of Texas. Samuel, now 6 months old and growing more alert every day, spent the celebration being passed from person to person, clearly enjoying the attention. When Thomas finally reclaimed him, holding his new son while his new wife cut the cake Rosa had baked, he felt a completeness he had never experienced before. This was his family now, his to protect and cherish, and he took that responsibility more seriously than anything in his life. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, which felt strange and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was patient and gentle, understanding that while Sarah had been married before, there was newness in this too, in choosing to give herself to someone out of love rather than duty. When she finally fell asleep in his arms, Thomas lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathe, watching moonlight paint silver patterns on the walls and counting himself the most fortunate man in Texas. Winter came, and they began planning for the spring when they would move to their new land. Thomas filed the papers and secured the loan from Henderson, paying it off with his wages and a portion of what Sarah earned. Every spare moment, he rode out to the property, beginning to clear the site where he would build their house, gathering stones for a foundation, cutting timber from the trees along the creek. Other ranch hands came to help sometimes, lending muscle and expertise, and slowly a structure began to take shape. Sarah spent the winter sewing and preparing, making curtains and quilts, gathering the small necessities that would turn a house into a home. She had taken off her wedding ring to David and put it away carefully in a small box, a memento of a different life. And now she wore a simple gold band that Thomas had bought in a town 30 miles away, far from the judgmental eyes of Redemption Creek. Samuel thrived through the winter, growing plump and healthy and hitting all the milestones a baby should. He babbled constantly, trying to form words, and he had taken a particular fascination with Thomas, reaching for him whenever he came into view and crying when he left. Thomas called him son now without hesitation, and to everyone on the ranch, that was simply what Samuel was, Thomas Garrett's boy. In February, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not been sure until the morning sickness started, that familiar queasy feeling she remembered from carrying Samuel. When she told Thomas, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then immediately became overly solicitous, insisting she sit down, put her feet up, not lift anything heavier than a spoon. "Thomas, I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said, exasperated but charmed. "I carried Samuel while working full-time and did just fine." "That was before you were my wife," Thomas said firmly, "and this time you are going to be properly taken care of. I will talk to Mr. Henderson about reducing your hours." Sarah rolled her eyes but did not argue too strenuously. It was nice, being cared for, being treated as precious. She had been on her own for so long that having someone worry about her health and happiness still felt novel and wonderful. By April, the house was finished, a sturdy 2-story structure with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a sitting room, and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It was not fancy, but it was solid and spacious and built with love. Thomas had carved their initials over the front door, along with the year 1877, marking this as the beginning of their new life. They moved in on a bright spring morning, loading their few possessions into the wagon, saying emotional goodbyes to the Hendersons and the ranch hands who had become friends. Henderson himself seemed sorry to see them go, particularly Mrs. Henderson, who had grown fond of Sarah. "You come back and visit," the older woman said, pressing a basket of food into Sarah's hands. "And when that baby comes, you send word. I want to know if it is a boy or a girl." "We will," Sarah promised, hugging her. "Thank you for everything. You gave us a home when we had nowhere else to go." "You earned it," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "and that husband of yours is a good man. You hold on to him." "I intend to," Sarah said, smiling. The first months on their own land were hard work but joyful. Thomas had bought 10 head of cattle with the last of his savings, planning to build the herd slowly, and he spent long days riding the property, checking fences, making sure the cattle did not stray. Sarah kept the house, tended a vegetable garden, and cared for Samuel, who was now walking unsteadily and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a 1-year-old. Neighbors were few and far between, but the ones they had were friendly. The Jorgensens to the north were a Norwegian family with 6 children who were delighted to have other young people nearby. To the west was an older bachelor rancher named Cal Winters, who kept mostly to himself, but proved reliable when Thomas needed help with a difficult task. None of them seemed to have heard the stories about Samuel being cursed, or if they had, they did not care. In September, Sarah went into labor 3 weeks early, and Thomas rode frantically to fetch the Jorgensen women. Mrs. Jorgensen and her eldest daughter came quickly, bringing supplies and competence, and they oversaw the birth with calm efficiency. This time there was no talk of curses or omens. When the baby emerged, a healthy boy with a shock of black hair and lungs that could wake the dead, Mrs. Jorgensen simply wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in Sarah's arms. "He is perfect," she declared. "Congratulations, Mrs. Garrett, you have a strong son." Thomas, who had been pacing outside on the porch, nearly broke the door down getting inside. When he saw Sarah holding the baby, both of them tired but well, his eyes filled with tears. "We have a son," Sarah said, smiling. "Thomas, meet James Thomas Garrett." Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out with a trembling hand to touch the baby's tiny fist. James immediately grabbed his finger and held on tight, and Thomas let out a shaky laugh. "Hey there, little James," he said softly. "Welcome to the family. Your big brother is going to be so excited to meet you." Samuel was indeed excited, though also slightly confused about why this small, noisy creature was suddenly living in his house. But with toddler adaptability, he quickly accepted his brother, even trying to help by bringing James his toys and patting him gently on the head. That winter was mild, and the family settled into a rhythm. Sarah juggled caring for a newborn and a toddler while Thomas worked to expand their herd and improve the property. Money was tight, but they had enough, and more importantly, they had each other. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Samuel playing on the floor, James nursing in Sarah's arms, and Thomas would read aloud from whatever book or newspaper he could get his hands on, and Sarah thought she had never been happier. The trouble they had left behind in Redemption Creek seemed like a distant memory until one day in March of 1878, when a rider came up the valley. Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw him approaching, and something about the rigid set of his shoulders made her uneasy. She called for Thomas, who came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag. The rider turned out to be a young deputy from Redemption Creek, a man Sarah vaguely recognized from town. He looked uncomfortable as he dismounted, holding an envelope. "Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Garrett," he said, nodding to them both. "I have been sent to deliver this. It is a letter from Preacher Blackwood and the town council." Thomas took the envelope, his expression darkening. "What do they want?" "I do not rightly know, sir," the deputy said. "I am just the messenger. They told me to make sure you received it and to wait for a reply if needed." Thomas tore open the envelope and read the letter, his face growing stonier with each line. When he finished, he handed it to Sarah without a word. She read quickly, her stomach sinking. The letter demanded that Thomas and Sarah return Samuel to Redemption Creek to be cleansed of his curse through a religious ceremony. It claimed that several bad events in town over the past year, a barn fire, a child's illness, a failed crop, were directly attributable to Samuel's continued existence and the refusal of his parents to acknowledge his cursed nature. The letter threatened legal action if they did not comply within 30 days. "This is insane," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "Samuel is 2 years old. He is a child, not a curse, and we are not taking him anywhere near those people." "I agree," Thomas said flatly. He looked at the deputy. "You can tell Preacher Blackwood and the town council that they can go straight to hell. We will not be complying with their demands now or ever." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I have to warn you, the preacher has been stirring up a lot of folks. There is talk of coming out here if you refuse, maybe taking the boy by force. I do not hold with it myself, but I thought you should know what you are facing." Thomas's hand moved to the gun at his hip, not drawing it but resting there, a clear message. "Let them come. This is my property and my family is under my protection. Anyone who tries to take my son will be met with force. You can tell them that too." The deputy nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. For what it is worth, I think this whole thing is foolishness, but be careful. The preacher has a lot of influence, and he is convinced he is doing God's work." After the deputy left, Sarah and Thomas stood together, watching him ride away. Samuel came toddling out of the house, followed by 3-year-old James, who was just learning to walk, and wrapped himself around Thomas's leg. "Pa," he said, looking up with worried eyes. Samuel rarely spoke, but when he did, it was usually to Thomas or Sarah. "Okay." Thomas scooped him up, holding him close. "We are okay, son. Everything is going to be fine." But Sarah saw the worry in her husband's eyes, and she knew that the peace they had found was under threat. That night, after the boys were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table and made plans. "We cannot just wait for them to come," Sarah said. "We need to be proactive." "I am thinking we should go to the county sheriff," Thomas said. "Lay out the situation, show him this letter. What the preacher is threatening is kidnapping. The law should be on our side." "Should be," Sarah said. "But you know how these things work. If enough people believe Samuel is cursed, the sheriff might not want to go against public opinion." Thomas rubbed his face, exhausted. "Then we make sure the sheriff knows that we will defend ourselves, and we ask our neighbors for help." Cal Winters is former military. The Jorgensens have a lot of kin in the area. If we need to make a stand, we will not be alone. It took 2 weeks to arrange, but finally, Thomas and Sarah rode into the county seat, bringing Samuel and James with them. They left the boys with a kindly woman who ran a boarding house and went to meet with Sheriff Dalton, a weathered man in his 50s who listened to their story with a skeptical expression. "That is quite a tale," he said when they finished. He looked at the letter from Preacher Blackwood, frowning. "I have heard some talk about this cursed baby business. Folks say the child has the devil's mark." "The child has a birthmark," Thomas said firmly. "Nothing more, and even if you believe in such things, he is my son now, legally adopted, and I will not let anyone harm him." Sheriff Dalton studied them both for a long moment. "You seem like good people," he said finally. "And I do not hold with vigilante justice, no matter the reason. If anyone from Redemption Creek tries to take your boy by force, they will be breaking the law and I will arrest them." "You have my word on that." "Will you go to Redemption Creek and tell them that?" Sarah asked. The sheriff sighed. "I will. I will make it clear that any action against your family will result in charges. But Mrs. Garrett, I have to be honest with you. I cannot control what people believe. If enough folks in that town are convinced your son is dangerous, there may be trouble no matter what I say." "Then we will be ready for it," Thomas said. They returned home that evening to find Cal Winters waiting on their porch, his rifle across his knees. "Jorgensen sent one of his boys over," he said without preamble. "Said there might be trouble heading your way, thought you could use an extra gun." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude. "Appreciate that, Cal. Come inside, we should talk." Over the next days they prepared. Cal and several of the Jorgensen men took turns keeping watch. Thomas made sure all his weapons were cleaned and loaded, and he taught Sarah how to shoot properly, though she was already a decent shot from hunting small game for the table. They stockpiled supplies in case of a siege and made plans to send the children to the Jorgensens at the first sign of real danger. The tension was exhausting, but Samuel and James remained blissfully unaware, playing and laughing as children do. Sarah tried to keep their routine as normal as possible, reading to them, singing songs, baking cookies. But at night she lay awake in Thomas's arms, listening for the sound of horses, for the shout that would mean the confrontation had finally come. It came on a Sunday in early April. A group of 15 men from Redemption Creek rode up the valley, led by Preacher Blackwood and several town council members. Thomas saw them coming from a mile away and sent Sarah to take the boys to the bedroom at the back of the house, the safest place if shooting started. He stood on his porch as they approached, his rifle held loosely in his hands, Cal Winters on one side and 3 Jorgensen men on the other. The riders stopped about 20 yards away, and Preacher Blackwood urged his horse forward a few steps. "Thomas Garrett," the preacher called out. "We have come for the cursed child. Hand him over peacefully and there will be no trouble." "There is no cursed child here," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "There is only my son, and you are not taking him anywhere. Turn around and go home before this gets ugly." "You are harboring an abomination," Blackwood insisted. "The child must be cleansed or driven out. This is God's will." "Funny how God's will always seems to align with what small-minded men want," Thomas said. "I have been to church, preacher. I have read the Bible. I do not recall the part where Jesus said to persecute innocent children." One of the men behind Blackwood, a rancher named Morrison, spoke up. Garrett, be reasonable. We do not want to hurt anyone. We just want to perform the ceremony and put this matter to rest. It is for the good of everyone, including the boy. The only thing that would be good for my boy is if you all rode away and left my family in peace, Thomas said. Now, Sheriff Dalton has been informed of this situation. If you try to take Samuel, you will be committing a crime and you will be arrested. Is that really worth it? There was muttering among the group of riders, some of them clearly having second thoughts, but Preacher Blackwood's face hardened. The law of God supersedes the law of man, he declared. We will take the child with or without your cooperation. He gestured to the men behind him and several started to dismount. Thomas raised his rifle. Last warning, he said. Take one more step toward my house and we will consider it an act of aggression. We will defend ourselves. There are 15 of us and 5 of you, Morrison said. You cannot win this. Maybe not, Cal Winters said, speaking for the first time, but I promise we will take at least half of you with us. You ready to die for this preacher's obsession, Morrison? How about you, Jenkins? You got a wife and kids waiting at home. The men who had dismounted hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. No one wanted to be the first to charge a group of armed, determined men. The standoff stretched out, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then a new voice called out from behind the group from town. What in the hell is going on here? Everyone turned to see Sheriff Dalton riding up, accompanied by 2 deputies. The lawman looked furious as he took in the scene. The armed standoff, the men from Redemption Creek clearly intent on confrontation. I thought I made myself clear, Blackwood, the sheriff said, riding through the group to position himself between them and Thomas's house. Any action against the Garrett family would be considered kidnapping and assault, yet here you are on their property threatening them. Care to explain? Preacher Blackwood's face was red with anger and frustration. We are doing the Lord's work, Sheriff. The child is cursed and his presence brings evil. We have a duty to act. Your duty is to follow the law, Dalton said flatly. And the law says that child is Thomas Garrett's son, legally adopted and protected under his rights as a father. You are trespassing. I am giving you one chance to turn around and go home before I start making arrests. You cannot arrest all of us, one of the men protested. No, but I can arrest the ringleaders, Dalton said, pulling out a set of shackles and looking pointedly at Preacher Blackwood. Starting with you, Preacher. Unless you would like to lead your flock back to town and forget this foolishness. For a long moment, it could have gone either way. Then Blackwood jerked his horse's reins, turning the animal sharply. This is not over, he said, glaring at Thomas. God's justice will find you. I will take my chances, Thomas said evenly. The group from Redemption Creek rode away, some of them looking relieved, others still muttering darkly. Sheriff Dalton waited until they were out of sight, then rode up to the porch. That was too close, he said. Garrett, I cannot keep coming out here every time they get riled up. You need to think seriously about moving, finding somewhere these people cannot reach you. This is my land, Thomas said. My home. I am not going to let them drive me off. Pride is a fine thing, Dalton said, but it is not worth dying for. Think about your wife and children. I am thinking about them, Thomas said. I am thinking that if we run now, we will spend the rest of our lives running. Someone will always believe Samuel is cursed somewhere. Better to make our stand here where we have friends and neighbors who will support us. The sheriff shook his head but did not argue further. After he left, Sarah emerged from the house, carrying James while Samuel clung to her skirts. She looked pale but composed. Is it over? She asked. For now, Thomas said, gathering them all into his arms. But Dalton is right. This is not going to end until Blackwood gives up or something changes in Redemption Creek. Then we stay vigilant, Sarah said, and we keep living our lives. We will not let them win by making us afraid in our own home. Thomas kissed the top of her head, drawing strength from her courage. That is my girl. We will get through this, I promise. The expected retaliation never came. Over the following weeks, they heard through the grapevine that Sheriff Dalton had paid several more visits to Redemption Creek. making it abundantly clear that any further action against the Garretts would result in serious legal consequences. More importantly, there was apparently a growing faction in town that was tired of Preacher Blackwood's obsession with Samuel, people who thought the whole thing had gone too far. By summer, the crisis seemed to have passed. Thomas and Sarah began to relax, to believe that maybe they really could build a peaceful life on their land. Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, and this time Thomas managed to contain his excitement to merely grinning like a fool for a week straight rather than constantly hovering. Their daughter was born in February of 1879, an easy birth that took only a few hours, and when Sarah held the tiny girl in her arms, she felt a sense of completion she had never quite achieved before. They named her Rose after Sarah's mother, and she was a happy, placid baby who seemed content to simply observe the world with big, curious eyes. Samuel, now 3.5, was intensely protective of his baby sister, always wanting to hold her, to make sure she was covered with a blanket to bring her toys. James, 2 years old and full of mischief, was less interested in the baby but enjoyed making her smile by making funny faces. Life settled into a comfortable routine. The ranch was doing well, with the herd growing and Thomas able to hire a seasonal hand during the busiest times. Sarah had her garden, her chickens, and her children to keep her busy, and in the evenings, the family would gather for dinner, and Thomas would tell stories about his day while the children listened with rapt attention. When Rose was 6 months old, they made the journey to visit the Hendersons, wanting to show off the new baby and catch up with the people who had helped them in their darkest time. Mr. Henderson was semi-retired now, having turned over most of the ranch operations to his oldest son, but he and his wife were delighted to see Thomas and Sarah again and to meet their growing family. "You have done well for yourselves, Mrs. Henderson said, admiring Rose and watching Samuel and James play in the yard. "I knew you would. Thomas is a good man and you are a strong woman, Sarah. That is a powerful combination." "We had help," Sarah said gratefully. "Without you giving us a chance when no one else would, none of this would have been possible." "Everyone deserves a chance," Mrs. Henderson said. "I just wish more people understood that." On the ride home, with Samuel and James asleep in the back of the wagon and Rose nursing contentedly, Thomas reached over to take Sarah's hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about expanding the house, maybe adding another bedroom or two. This family seems to be growing and we are going to need the space." Sarah laughed. "Thomas Garrett, are you saying you want more children?" "I am saying I would not mind if more came along," he said, grinning. "I like being a father and you are pretty good at being a mother." "Pretty good," Sarah said, raising an eyebrow. "I will have you know I am excellent at being a mother." "Yes, ma'am, you absolutely are," Thomas said, bringing her hand to his lips. "I am the luckiest man in Texas, married to the most excellent mother and the most beautiful woman I have ever known." Sarah blushed, pleased despite herself. Even after 3 years of marriage, Thomas could still make her feel like a young girl with his compliments and his obvious devotion. She leaned against his shoulder as the wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk, feeling deeply content. Over the next years, their life continued to unfold in ways both expected and surprising. They did expand the house, adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor. Another son, John, was born in 1881, and then twin girls, Emma and Grace, in 1883. The house was always full of noise and activity, children running and playing, and Sarah often fell into bed at night exhausted but happy. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses and books in equal measure. The birthmark on his chest faded somewhat as he grew, becoming less noticeable, but he was aware of the story of his birth, the circumstances that had nearly destroyed his life before it began. Thomas and Sarah never hid the truth from him, believing that honesty was always better than secrets, and Samuel seemed to take it in stride. "Do you think I really am cursed?" he asked Sarah one day when he was 7, helping her shell peas on the front porch. Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at her oldest son seriously. "No, Samuel, you are not cursed. You never were. You are blessed. You survived being born under hard circumstances, and you have grown into a kind, smart, strong boy. That birthmark on your chest does not mean anything except that you are unique, and unique is a wonderful thing to be." "Pa says the same thing," Samuel said. "He says the people who called me cursed were just afraid of what they did not understand." "Your pa is a wise man," Sarah said, ruffling his hair. "You should listen to him." "I do," Samuel said solemnly. "I want to be just like him when I grow up, strong and brave and good at ranching." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. He would love to hear that. "And I know you will be all those things and more." Thomas overheard this conversation from inside the house, where he was supposed to be fixing a broken chair, and he had to stop and wipe his own eyes. His children thought he was strong and brave, wanted to be like him, and it was humbling and terrifying and wonderful all at once. When Samuel was 10 and starting to take on more serious responsibilities around the ranch, they finally received word that Preacher Blackwood had died of a heart attack. The news came through Cal Winters, who still kept his ear to the ground in Redemption Creek despite living miles away. "Thought you would want to know," he said, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The old firebrand finally met his maker. "Wonder what they are talking about right now." Thomas felt a complicated mix of emotions. He had hated what Blackwood tried to do to his family, but he took no pleasure in anyone's death. "I hope he found peace," he said finally, "and I hope he understands now that he was wrong." "With Blackwood gone, a lot of the old fears have died down," Cal continued. "The new preacher is a younger fellow, much more progressive, talks about love and forgiveness instead of hellfire. Town is changing, Thomas. You and Sarah might be able to go back there now without trouble." Sarah and Thomas exchanged glances. "We have no need to go back," Sarah said. "Our life is here, but it is good to know that particular chapter is truly closed." That summer, they took all the children on a camping trip up into the hills, something they tried to do every year. It was a chance to get away from the daily grind of ranch work, to simply be a family enjoying the beauty of the Texas landscape. They set up camp near a stream, and Thomas taught the older boys how to fish while Sarah supervised the younger children splashing in the shallows. In the evening, they sat around the campfire, roasting meat and telling stories. Samuel, now old enough to appreciate the tale, asked to hear about how his parents met, how they fell in love, and Sarah and Thomas took turns recounting the story. The road outside Redemption Creek, the fear and uncertainty, the choice to help a stranger, the slow building of trust and affection. "So Pa saved us," Samuel said when they finished, looking at Thomas with adoring eyes. "Your Pa and I saved each other," Sarah corrected gently. "I was alone and scared, and he gave me hope. But I like to think I gave him something too, a family, a purpose, a reason to put down roots." That is how love works, Samuel. It is not about one person rescuing another. It is about two people choosing to face life together, to be stronger together than they could be apart. Thomas reached across the fire to take her hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture so familiar it was almost unconscious. "Your mother is the wise one in this family," he said. "I just got lucky that she agreed to take a chance on a cowboy with more dreams than dollars." "Those dreams turned out pretty well," Sarah said softly, looking around at their children, at the life they had built together. "More than I ever imagined possible." As the fire burned down and the children began to drowse, Thomas and Sarah sat together under the stars, wrapped in a single blanket, and reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that desperate moment on a dusty road to this peaceful evening surrounded by their family, it had been a path filled with challenges and moments of fear, but also overwhelming love and joy. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Taking me up on my proposal, tying your life to mine?" Sarah turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the dying firelight. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "You are the best man I have ever known, Thomas Garrett, and loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." Every challenge we have faced together, and that has made all the difference." Thomas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Sarah, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." "That is terribly romantic for a cowboy," Sarah teased, but her voice was thick with emotion. "I learned from the best," Thomas said, and she knew he meant her. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. The ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the county. Thomas gained a reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher, and people began coming to him for advice. Sarah became known for her kindness and her willingness to help neighbors in need, delivering babies, nursing the sick, always with a jar of her famous preserves as a gift. Samuel grew into a tall, capable young man who could ride better than most men twice his age, and who had his mother's fierce compassion and his father's steady strength. When he was 18, he began courting the youngest Jorgensen daughter, a sweet girl named Ingrid, and Thomas and Sarah watched with joy as their oldest son fell in love. James became a scholar, much to everyone's surprise, devouring every book he could get his hands on and eventually leaving for college in Austin, determined to become a lawyer. The daughters each found their own paths as well. Rose into teaching, Emma into medicine after an apprenticeship with the circuit doctor, and Grace into ranching, proving herself as capable as any of her brothers. John, the youngest, stayed on the ranch, working alongside Thomas and eventually taking over more and more of the day-to-day operations as his father aged. In the spring of 1896, Thomas and Sarah celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children threw a party at the ranch, inviting all the neighbors and friends they had made over the decades. It was a joyous occasion, with music and dancing and enough food to feed an army. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Thomas and Sarah stood on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They were both in their late 40s now, with lines on their faces and gray beginning to thread through their hair, but to each other, they were as beautiful as the day they met. 20 years, Sarah marveled. It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. Best 20 years of my life, Thomas said, slipping his arm around her waist. And if I am lucky, I will get 20 more. We will grow old together, Sarah said, leaning into him. Watch our grandchildren grow, maybe even meet our great-grandchildren if we are blessed. Speaking of grandchildren, Thomas said with a grin, Samuel told me this afternoon that Ingrid is expecting. We are going to be grandparents. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Really? Oh, Thomas, that is wonderful news. I know, he said, his voice full of satisfaction. Our first grandchild, the family continues. Sarah thought about that baby growing in Ingrid's belly, about how it would be Samuel's child, the son who had been called cursed but had grown into such a fine man. I hope it is a boy, she said. I hope it looks just like Samuel, birthmark and all, so everyone can see that there was never anything wrong with him, that he was always perfect. Even if it is a girl, she will be perfect too, Thomas said, because she will be ours, part of this family, and this family knows how to love. They stood there as darkness fell, holding each other, thinking about all they had survived and built together. The town had said Sarah's baby was cursed at birth, but Thomas had held the child and called him blessed, and in doing so, he had changed everything. He had given Sarah hope when she had none, had loved her when she felt unlovable, had stood beside her through every trial and triumph. And Sarah had given him the same in return, a home, a family, a life full of meaning and purpose. Together, they had proven that love was stronger than fear, that compassion could overcome cruelty, and that what others called cursed could become the greatest blessing of all. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah reached up to touch Thomas's face, tracing the familiar lines and angles she knew better than her own. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing us when no one else would, for loving us when the world wanted us gone. For being the man I always needed but never knew to hope for. Thomas turned to kiss her palm, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for trusting me enough to stay, for building this life with me, for making me a father and showing me what it means to truly love someone. You and Samuel saved me just as much as I saved you." They went inside then, to the home they had built with their own hands, filled with the memories of 20 years of laughter and tears, struggles and celebrations. Their children were scattered now, some still at the ranch, others making their own ways in the world, but all of them carried the lessons they had learned here. That family was everything, that love conquered all, and that the marks we bear, whether on our skin or in our hearts, do not define us unless we let them. Samuel's first child was indeed a boy, born healthy and strong in the winter of 1897, and when Thomas held his grandson for the first time, he thought about that moment 21 years earlier when he had held Samuel on a dusty road and called him blessed. He had been right then, and time had proven it. Samuel had grown into everything Thomas could have hoped and more, and this new baby, his grandson, was proof that the Garrett family line would continue strong and resilient. "What will you name him?" Thomas asked Samuel, who stood nearby with Ingrid, both of them beaming with pride and exhaustion. "Thomas," Samuel said without hesitation. "Thomas David Garrett, after you and after my birth father, both the men who made me who I am." Thomas had to turn away for a moment, overcome with emotion. When he regained his composure, he handed the baby to Sarah, who cooed over her grandson with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own. "He is beautiful," she declared. "Absolutely perfect. Welcome to the world, little Thomas." The years that followed were golden ones. Thomas and Sarah gradually retired from active work, turning the ranch over to John and Samuel, who ran it together with efficiency and innovation. They spent their time enjoying their grandchildren, of which there were eventually 12, and puttering around the garden and the house that had become the center of their universe. They traveled occasionally, visiting James in Austin, going to Rose's wedding in Dallas, attending Emma's medical school graduation. But they always came home to the valley, to the land that had given them sanctuary and purpose, to the house that held all their memories. In 1905, they celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them, sitting on the porch and watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. Thomas was 60 now, Sarah 53, and they were both starting to feel the weight of age, the aches and pains that came with a life of hard work. But they were content, fulfilled in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or status and everything to do with the love they had built and nurtured over nearly 3 decades. "I have been thinking about that day we met," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You were sitting under that tree, looking so fierce and frightened and determined all at once, and I knew in that moment that my life was about to change." "I was terrified," Sarah admitted. "I thought Samuel and I would die out there, that no one would help us, that the world was truly as cruel as it seemed. And then you rode up and looked at my son with such kindness, and you called him blessed, and I felt hope for the first time in months." "He was blessed," Thomas said firmly. "Is blessed. Look at the man he has become, the family he is raising. Look at all our children, Sarah. We did that together. We built something that will last long after we are gone." Sarah took his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically. "I love you, Thomas Garrett. From that first day to this one and beyond, you have been my rock, my partner, my great love. Whatever time we have left, I want to spend it right here with you, watching our family grow and knowing that we got it right." "We did get it right," Thomas agreed. "Against all odds, despite what anyone said or believed, we got it exactly right." They sat there until full dark, holding hands, remembering and dreaming, grateful beyond measure for the life they had shared. The town had said her baby was cursed at birth, but the cowboy had held the child and called him blessed, and in that single act of faith and defiance, he had set in motion a love story that would ripple through generations, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and unwavering devotion. As the moon rose over the valley, silvering the grassland and the creek that ran through their property, Sarah and Thomas went inside together, climbing the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 28 years, and they lay down side by side as they had done thousands of times before, still in love, still grateful, still convinced that meeting each other had been the greatest blessing of their lives. The future stretched out before their family, full of promise and possibility, built on the foundation of love that Sarah and Thomas had laid. And somewhere in the heart of Texas, in a valley where wildflowers bloomed and cattle grazed peacefully, their legacy lived on, not in wealth or fame, but in the lives they had touched, the children they had raised, and the enduring truth that love, real love, can overcome anything the world throws at it. They had proven that curses were nothing but words, that marks on the skin meant nothing compared to the content of one's character, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply refusing to turn away, refusing to give in to fear, and choosing instead to love with everything you have. And they lived, loved, and died happy, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that their lives had mattered, that they had made a difference, and that the love they shared would echo through time, inspiring generations yet to come to choose compassion over cruelty, hope over despair, and love over everything else. The end came peacefully for them both, as these things sometimes do for couples who have been together so long they can hardly imagine existing apart. Thomas passed first, in his sleep in the winter of 1907, at the age of 62, with Sarah's hand in his and all his children gathered around. Samuel held his father as he took his last breath, and later would say that Thomas's final expression was one of perfect contentment. Sarah lived only 3 months longer. The doctors said it was her heart, worn out from a lifetime of hard work, but her children knew better. She had died of a broken heart, unable to imagine continuing without the man who had been her partner, her protector, her great love for 30 years. She passed on a spring morning, with wildflowers blooming outside her window and her children and grandchildren surrounding her bed, and her last words were, "Tell Thomas I am coming." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, beneath a large oak tree that Thomas had planted the year they moved to the property. The headstones were simple but bore inscriptions that told their story. Thomas Garrett, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, 1845 to 1907, he saw blessing where others saw curse. And Sarah Mitchell Garrett, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, 1853 to 1907, she loved fiercely and without fear. The ranch continued under Samuel and John's management, eventually passing to Thomas David Garrett and his siblings. The Garrett family became one of the most respected in the county, known for their integrity, their compassion, and their willingness to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. And every year, on the anniversary of Thomas and Sarah's wedding, the family would gather at the ranch for a celebration, telling the story of how it all began, of a desperate widow, a marked baby, and a cowboy who saw past fear and superstition to the truth beneath. They told it so their children would know where they came from, what they were built on, and what values they were expected to uphold. The story of Sarah and Thomas became legend in the family, a reminder that love was not just a feeling but a choice, an action, a daily commitment to stand by someone even when the world stood against them. It was a reminder that true strength lay not in wealth or power but in compassion and courage, and that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was simply refuse to believe what everyone else believed, and instead trust your own heart. And in the heart of Texas, in a valley where wildflowers still bloom and cattle still graze, the descendants of Samuel Garrett live and work and raise their own families, carrying forward the legacy of the grandmother and grandfather they never knew but whose love story shaped everything they became. Because Sarah Mitchell's baby was not cursed, despite what the town said. He was blessed, just as Thomas Garrett knew from the moment he held him, and that blessing rippled forward through time, touching every life that came after, proving once and for all that love, real love, is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transforming curses into blessings and fear into hope, and creating something beautiful and lasting that even death cannot diminish.